getting the call, it happened differently for me than it did for my husband. But it happened for me first. It was my last, it happened on a particular day, a particular moment of time. It was my last day of work helping him get through seminary. And that next Sunday, I was going to become a pastor's wife. And as I was driving home from work that day, all I could think about was, you know, my husband's been going to school all these years to find out what God wants him to do. Now, what does God want me to do? And so as I thought about it all the way home, as soon as I got into the house, that was the first thing I asked Steve. I said, what does God want me to do? And he looks at me and he says, well, that's simple. He wants you to do stuff for me and stuff for the church. And you know what? I wanted a more specific job description than that. And it began a search for me. A search to find what it is God wanted me to do. I go to church that first Sunday and I asked different people there. It says, what does a pastor's wife do? And they said, oh, that's simple. You work in the nursery and you play the piano. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I have flunked from the very beginning because I did not do well with large groups of children. One-on-one, fine, but you get them in large groups and I was totally out of my realm. And I could play a little bit of piano, but nothing like what they were talking about as far as playing for the congregation. And so I began trying everything there was at the church to do, and everything in the community there was to do. I went to classes, and I went to conferences, and I took everything and anything. I was very serious about this. I was passionate about finding what God wanted me to do. One day, a friend handed me a brochure from a Mount Hermon Writers Conference. And she said, I think you ought to try to do this. And I picked it up and I said, sure. I've tried everything else, I'll try this too. And so in that year, the Writers Conferences were always during Easter week. So my husband was not able to come with me, but he took care of the two boys and he said, you go. And I went and I was enthralled with the whole thing. I was rubbing elbows with writers, looking across the dinner table at editors, publishers. At that time there wasn't a lot said about agents in those early days. But anyway, I just was enthralled. And so that whole next year, all I did was be enthralled about writing. But I decided to go back to the Writers' Conference the second year. The second year, I learned how to do things. I learned how to, prepare a manuscript, how to send it to an editor, how all of the things, the processes of things. I went home at the end of our bedroom. I set up the typewriter, and I set up file drawers, and I started writing things. I wrote fillers, those little sidebar type things, little filler things, and began to send them to editors and all, and was getting a few little responses. And right in the midst of all this flurry and excitement, my husband was looking for someone to transcribe his sermons. Now, that is really quite an involved project. They were taped, and they needed somebody to type them up. So every Sunday in the bulletin, is there anyone who would volunteer to transcribe the sermon? And nobody was coming forward. And one day I was praying to the Lord and I said, Lord, nobody's wanting to do this. And I heard his voice say, you do it. And I said, Lord, I can't do that. You see, I'm trying to find your will for my life. And he says, you do it. So I began to transcribe my husband's sermons, and it would take days to do it. You know, stop and start, stop and, you know, type the whole thing. And so one day when I was doing this, I was looking down at what I was typing, and I said, you know what? Some of these could be made into stories. Some of this could be made into articles. You know, he had that flair in his sermons. You know, he was a storyteller, and he had very practical. His sermons were very practical. You know, things to do, and there were just lists of things. You know, and so I thought about it, and I went to him and I says, would you mind, I'm learning how to do this, you know, how to send things to editors. Would you mind if I cleaned these things up and prepared them and sent some of your things to the editors? And he thought about it, says, okay, I'll let you do that, but don't get me involved in writing. This is your thing, not my thing. And so I began to do that. I was sending my fillers, and I was sending his articles and his stories. Well, one day we go to the mailbox, and there's 2 thin envelopes. Well, in those days we sent the manuscripts in thick envelopes off, and 2 thin envelopes came back. And inside were 2 different acceptance letters and 2 different checks to my husband. And he looked at that and he said, well, maybe I could try the writing myself too. And so it was a great thing that he got involved too. And we became partners in this. And not everybody has a partner or needs a partner, but for us it was crucial because I was the editor. I could clean things up. I could present them. I could work them. He was the creative guy. I mean, he had ideas until the last breath he took on earth. Ideas, just enormous, you know, numbers of ideas in his mind. But he didn't want to mess with all of the grammar and the formatting and all of that. So he would just flow things out and I would fix them. And that was our system for a long, long time. Of course, I had my own projects and that. And he got better with it as he went along. But we were a team. We were a partnership.